So, which of the following dinosaurs is the best?
Okay.
T-Rex,
Eh.
Spinosaurus,
Ugh.
or Velociraptor?
First off, Spinosaurus is the worst dinosaur, hands down, of all dinosaurs of all time.
I know
Don't you
you.
dare cut this on social media.
Hi, everyone. My name's David. Welcome to the Biogeoverse podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Meaghan Wetherell. Meaghan is a professor in the data science department in the college over at University of Arizona. Meaghan and I have known each other for going on 20 years, horrifyingly.
Yep. I was trying to figure that out yesterday. I think I met you when I was 16. And are you a year older than me or a
I
year
think
younger?
so. Yeah.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think so. Because I think it was my last year before collegey stuff or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So
so yeah,
16 and
so
17.
at Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, Hancock Field Station. Meaghan is a vertebrate paleontologist, among other things, by training, and we're definitely going to talk about some other stuff today. Meaghan, could you kind of give the folks a quick and dirty on your background real quick?
Sure. So let's see. My background, my career path has been very meandering. So a quick and dirty is I got a bachelor's degree in biology, and then it was the 2008 recession. So I went and taught English in Taiwan for a year. Then I came back and I worked at OMSI again for a couple of years. And then I got bored. So I went to go become a slug researcher for 2 years, where my job was to wander around the woods alone looking for rare and endangered species of slugs. And then I decided I did want to go back to graduate school because I liked the science aspect, but maybe I liked things with bones. So I went back to graduate school at University of Oregon and got a PhD in vertebrate paleontology. And then I was kind of tired, so I decided that maybe I'd actually want to do some data science stuff for a while. So I went and worked in uh, institutional effectiveness, which if you guys are not familiar with that department, it's like the people who creep on you and try to figure out why you did or didn't enroll. That was my job for a year, doing all the creepy data mining on our students. And then I got a job working as a lecturer there for a year in the geology department, and then ended up at University of Arizona. But I live in Washington because I teach everything online, because I work in the College of Information Science, and I teach things like science communication, game design, statistics, data visualization. Notice how none of those have the words paleontology in the name. Um, yeah, so that's the quick and dirty is just boop, 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 and now here I am. Yeah, it made it so much easier, and there's so many like graphics that you can use in R to help you kind of understand what you're doing. And
Right.
when I went back to graduate school and I saw all of the cool science that people were doing, the stuff that I was most interested in was the stuff that definitely required much higher degree of math than I had at the time. So I think I also finally had the motivation to like sit down and really understand it. So
Well, having some success or I don't know,
yeah.
getting positive feedback as opposed to always just being like, so you mentioned the data science stuff in there. Was that something that you were kind of always into through like high school and pre-college, or did that stuff kind of come later?
Um, so I definitely have a learning disability. I have ADHD for sure. That one is diagnosed and recognized, although not until after graduate school, actually. But I also have a numeric form of dyslexia, which have not been able to get identified, but I know for sure I have it, which is why when I was doing math all throughout high school, all throughout college, it was just a slog. It was just such a struggle because everyone wanted me to do it by hand. And they wanted me to write down numbers, unaware that I can't write down probably three or more numbers in a row without probably messing up at least one of those numbers. So even though I understood all the math steps, my teachers would write, you clearly know how to do this. You just dropped a digit. Like, well, yeah. But
Disappointing.
right, like just, like a whole order of magnitude off. But then I went to graduate school, and I learned that you could do all of that with a computer. And when you do it
hmm
with a computer, it turns it into writing a language and not writing a
Right.
series of numbers. So now I am very good at coding in R. I teach students how to do it because I can do that. I can do languages. I can do writing sentences.
Right.
I understand the statistics. I just can't, I literally can't write one number consistently in two separate lines. It's the weirdest block of all time. But now that I know that about myself and I have these tools, I love math and I love teaching math. I can't do it by hand.
Yeah, I had
So
a very similar experience where in grad school learning R and being very like I wouldn't go so far as to say that I was bad at it, but it definitely wasn't something that I found any joy in
yeah,
or anything like that. And being able to write script, it was almost like a little machine where each part had its little
yeah,
job.
yeah,
And you just stick pieces together. Once you kind of know what pieces and sub pieces do, and all of a sudden you have a little machine, and you stick the little machines together, and now you have
yeah,
like the system that does a thing. And that
yeah,
made it a lot easier to think about as opposed to like this abstract, like numbers interacting with numbers in the abstract.
yeah,
No, 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 no.
yeah. Like,
Can
what is
do
wrong with you?
do wonders for one's self-motivation to stick
Yeah,
with something that is inevitably going to be difficult in some way or another.
yeah, true.
You mentioned your slug surveying, and
Yeah,
I did want to touch on that because I think that that's a really interesting bit of cross-disciplinary experience and training,
yeah,
where I don't know, a lot of the students that I meet, or even folks who are a bit early in their career, have maybe gone on this kind of linear path into whatever field of science that they're in, where they're kind of doing very, very similar things all the way through. Whereas this is like going out into the field and doing field ecology in some
hmm,
ways with modern invertebrates.
yeah,
So, but I imagine that that had some professionally relevant lessons. Is there anything that you can pass on from that as far as,
sure,
I don't know, encouraging younger students, especially, to get diverse experience?
sure. I mean, probably the biggest one was that at the time, being a paleontologist, like a paleontology field researcher, was paying about $14 if you got a good job. And being a slug scientist was 25. So, you know, there was a big difference right there. And even though most of what I did was slugs, I was working for a really small biological consulting company. And so we would kind of switch depending on basically our boss would apply for different contracts. And while most of them ended up being slug contracts because none of the big companies really wanted to do that, we also did like stream surveys. We did botany surveys. I did a little bit of salamander and frog work. And it was a really nice opportunity to just to kind of see like the full breadth of the different types of surveys. And I was helping with things like report writing and analyzing some of our data and kind of seeing how like survey protocol really varies between different things, which I think is really important because you can kind of get like this myopic view a little bit when you are dealing with one particular science where you're
Right.
like, oh, the only way you find fossils is you go and you sit and you dig up a dinosaur that someone found 10 years ago and still hasn't gotten out of the ground yet. And as you know from mammalian paleontology, that is not how 90% of it goes. And yeah, it was nice to see some of those differences in survey design between things like slugs and plants and fossils. And I would, I was by myself almost all of the time, which I think is kind of a scary prospect, but was really nice for me.
Mhm.
Listened to a lot of audiobooks in the woods, scared a lot of strangers by accident bursting out of the bushes, and would just be I was getting real weird because I was alone too much. And I just remember like anytime you get a contract for a biology job, there's like 10 other contracts by other companies because they're not just looking for slugs. They're going to be looking for rare mushrooms and tree voles and stuff. And so I would like jump out of the bushes because I would see someone with a different color of flagging tape than me and just interrogate them in the middle of the woods about what it was they were doing because I was just so curious and also so alone. Yeah, I think that it was good both on like a scientific level, seeing how other people do things and seeing kind of all the variety that's out there. And then on a personal level, it really pushed me to be okay with doing field work by myself in
Sure.
extreme situations, extreme scenarios. I really got to understand the ins and outs of what was and was not good rainwear.
Yeah, in Oregon, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah, well, slugs and snails, they like the rain. So when it's raining, that's when you're most likely to find them. So, um, yeah, really got to understand what goes into a good REI rain jacket. Hmm. And which ones are going to smell like tuna fish if you eat tuna fish for lunch. Um, Turns out that there's some certain fabrics that really are just not good for.
Really seal in the flavor.
Oh yeah, yeah, and right next to your face. Yeah, that's great. You zip that hood all the way up, and then you're just for the rest of the day. Nasty.
Do you remember which brand was the worst? We'll do a shout out here.
Um,
Put somebody on
it
blast.
was uh, what was it? It wasn't Arc'teryx. It was another really expensive brand. Oh God, what? Marmot? Yeah, I think it was Marmot. Um, and it was because they had like this microfiber cloth that they put right in front of your face, which was great because it meant that like my hood didn't rub on my nose, but it also meant that my hood absorbed and retained whatever
Everything.
smells.
Yeah.
Yeah, just everything. Yeah. You think masking is bad, guys? I want you to imagine running around in the woods smelling your own tuna fish breath from 10 days ago. It's not great. Yeah.
Did your time doing the survey work, like this is a job, obviously,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
was before you went to grad school. Do you
Yeah.
think that having that kind of a like actual job, um, where you were writing reports and like reporting to supervisor, do you think that that had any positive impacts on
Absolutely. Yeah.
your ability to, I don't know, perform or pursue things as a graduate student?
Yeah. I think that it instilled a lot of independence, but also when I was in undergraduate, like nobody ever encouraged me to go into science. Like I was getting a degree in a very big college. People didn't really know who I was. Even the classes where I was getting like A pluses because I really got the material. The instructors never sat me down and were like, "So what's your future career path?" And even like my college advisor was like, "So you're going into teaching? Okay, cool." And never was like, "Have you considered research?" So
Right.
going and actually doing all of this slug research, I part of the reason I changed career paths was because I wanted to see if research maybe was for me actually. And by the time that I left, I knew that that was actually what I wanted to do. I wanted to do some form of research, but I also kind of found out that like with a lot of these surveying companies, and it doesn't really matter what you're surveying for, but a lot of them are like inventorying surveys. So they're just tell me what's out there and nothing more. So like I would go out into the woods and if I would just write down what I found and we'd write up that report. We found 10 Monodenia fidelis, whatever, and send that in. And that was full stop the last thing that happened with that data. And part of the reason I went back to graduate school was just I realized I wanted to do science, and B, I realized how kind of frustrating it was that like we were collecting all of this extremely interesting information and doing absolutely nothing with it because even though we collected all this stuff, it was just to answer one question, which was, are there rare slugs and snails that we're going to have to account for when we cut down this section of the woods?
Right.
And if the answer was no, there you go. That was it. So I think it gave me a lot of like curiosity. And then, yeah, of course, it gave me really important skills like being able to independently conduct research. It gave me the skills to do all of this report writing. It gave me
Right.
ideas on survey protocol. Right when I came into graduate school, my advisor asked me to start writing some of the BLM reports for them because I had already had experience writing stuff like that, just not about dead things and more about slugs. So yeah, it gave me a lot of important skills, and I think even more importantly, motivation, which is really key for graduate school.
And I imagine a different sense of accountability compared to being an
Yeah.
undergrad, where it's like project, test, read the book, show up, take notes. It's a bit less, well, I imagine it's a lot less structured in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, like it's yeah, graduate school, one of the big shifts that people kind of have to go through is the idea that you're usually not being handed a project
Right.
and kind of the person knows what the answer is. the idea of being a scientist is you're working on projects where nobody knows what the answer is, and you have to
Right.
figure out how to find out what the answer is, figure out the answer, and then have enough confidence in yourself to present and defend that answer.
Right.
And I think that the field work really helped me kind of build some of that confidence because like I wasn't like an official field lead, but on the occasions where there was more than one of us on the team, I'm very bossy. So I was doing a lot of like, okay, I don't know why you decided to take that route, but I think tomorrow you should take this route and you should write it down. So if you fall and die, we know where to look for your body. Uh, so I was doing a lot of the managing on the ground because our boss was usually off writing contracts trying to get more work for us instead of actually going out into the field, which makes perfect sense.
Right.
Um, and so figuring out like the best ways to accomplish tasks. It was honestly a lot of administrative work,
Right.
but it was a lot of self-directed administrative work that if I didn't do it, nobody was gonna do it, and things would get done really inefficiently and poorly. And then I'd have to hike in 5 miles to just do one spot and look in one spot, and I'd be really pissed off about it. So um, I think that that gave me some of the administrative skills that you definitely need as a graduate student, like some of the self-organization, but it also gave me like, I don't know, a little bit more confidence in my ability to actually do that and to boss around other people to do it for me, which uh, is also key. If you can boss
Crucial.
around your advisor, by the way, guys, your life is going to be really easy. So me being able to bully Edward a little bit into listening to me was definitely helpful.
As we've been kind of talking about, you've had a quite a diversity of things you've done successfully
Mhm.
in your career so far. What advice do you have for students who are looking to build kind of a career flexible resume?
Ooh, I would say, I mean, first off, go kind of where your heart leads you. You don't actually ever have any understanding of what's going to turn out to be super important. I think probably the best example is the current job that I have, where I work for University of Arizona. Um, I didn't get that because of my data science background, which I think surprises a lot of people because when you hear that I'm teaching science communication, data science, game design, data visualization, statistics, people really harp on that statistics one. Oh, you must have, like, that's why you got it. You have that statistics background. And it's not. It's because I worked for PBS Eons. I forgot that part of my journey, but
We'll get to that. Don't worry.
I'm also worked as a freelance writer for PBS Eons. I worked as a freelance writer at this point for a couple of other YouTube channels. So doing science writing and doing science communication, I also did a National Geographic documentary. That was the thing that really got me this job because the statistics, there's thousands of people out there who have statistics,
Right.
but having a combination of statistics and science communication skills, that especially strong science communication skills where you've actually published things and you've done things publicly, that was what got me my job. So I think that there are lots and lots of jobs out there where you think that there's going to be one thing that makes you stand out, and it actually makes you just look like everybody else. Like my data science background made me look like every other candidate. It was the other things that
Right.
I could do that made me stand out. And I think that you should not be afraid to pursue weird alternate side quests because they might turn out to be the thing that you end up doing. And I think that's really important because in academia, I was told to not do PBS eons and
Right.
to not write for things like that because that was not going to get me a job. Like writing papers was what it was going to get me a job. I should concentrate on the science and not the science communication. And that turned out to be completely incorrect advice that I'm really glad that I ignored. For one, PBS Eons pays me, which is also a good thing. You should get paid.
Dang. Yeah. So speaking of some of your science communication and some of this other stuff that you've done, in make sure I've got this right. So in 2013,
Mhm,
among a bunch of other awards that
mhm.
I know you got, you won a People's Choice Award for your 3-minute thesis
Oh yeah.
presentation um, at
I was so
University.
mad I didn't win first place. Oh, I just furious even now.
But
Anyways.
in that you used I think it was Lindsay Lohan's kind of cosmetic evolution uh,
Yes, yeah.
to communicate about biologically relevant changes in
Hmm.
mammals, I think in that case, and
Hmm.
oriodonts and or animals that have trunks.
Yeah.
Um, have you found that how have you found that those kind of pop culture references help with your kind of science communication strategy?
I mean, I think that it's it's depends on your audience, right? So like that was perfect for that audience because that was a general audience. I have found that talking to science specific audiences, I have to pretend I'm not a girl. So I can make pop culture references that are about Star Wars. But if I make pop culture references that are about Lindsay Lohan or the Kardashians, it's not going to go over well with that particular audience, which I think is a bit of a problem just because I know that a lot of it is gendered, but also a lot of it is that we're real big nerds in, I'm apologizing. We're very big nerds in paleontology. And so being big nerds in paleontology, the pop culture references that people are usually going to get is that. But I also have found that when I do make pop culture references that are specifically what paleontology would consider weird niches and what the rest of the world would consider, oh, of course we know more about Lindsay Lohan than we do about Star Wars or Marvel Comics, that is also a good way of establishing kind of like a relationship with some of the people in the crowd that maybe don't get talked to or don't
Mhm.
understand some of the other references quite as well. So yeah, there's always risks with pop culture references in science communication because you have to kind of know your audience and you have to know what pop culture is actually going to resonate with them.
Right.
But you also have to remember that sometimes the audience you're writing for is maybe not the main group there. Maybe sometimes you actually want to reach the people who get a little bit ignored.
I'll let our audience know that if you want SciComm but with profanity,
Yeah.
you check out Weird and Dead the
Yes.
Weird and Dead podcast with Meaghan
Yeah.
and co-host Amy Atwater.
Yeah.
We'll
We'll bleep
between
it,
the
I'm
two of
sure,
us, we
here.
balance out to a PG-13 rating.
That's right. Everybody's going to take me down. After working at science camps for so long, I don't know how you've maintained your sanity, but I feel like there was just like a critical mass of curse words that just kind of accumulated in me after not being able to curse for so many years. And now I can't stop.
So here's how I mean, I'll let you know how I deal with that. I run a pretty loose ship with the kids, where I tell them like,
Mhm.
this is not Quentin Tarantino paleontology camp. One. Two, unless you're directing it at someone, I probably
Mhm.
don't care. You'll
Yeah,
probably
that's
hear it
fair.
from me once in a while. Like some things are gonna slip out and we're just gonna run with it.
Yeah.
So it's like if you direct it at a staff member or a student, we're immediately gonna have a problem. If
It
you
doesn't
hit
matter if
your
it's cursing at that point, too.
yeah,
Like you
yeah, yeah,
could
yeah.
say, oh, dang you off to heck, and it's still you being
Yeah.
rude. Weird, also, if you say it that way, but like the rudeness is the real issue.
Yeah, but if it's like really hot out and you drop some profanity exclaiming how hot it is, I'm probably not gonna like come berate you. I'm like, yeah, it is. You're right.
Like, yeah, it's 105 degrees. I
Yeah,
agree. Yeah.
it is. It is that. It is that
Yeah.
warm, in fact.
I
Um,
will say I have actually found on social media cursing can sometimes help me maintain an audience, which is kind of weird. Like I do on TikTok, I do a lot of like voiceovers. And at this point, I guess my voice sounds refined enough and old enough that people are like, this nice woman is just, oh, she's telling it. Why did she just drop the F bomb? And so it does sometimes catch people's attention in a way that it might not otherwise be maintained.
so speaking of cursing, how in your mind are Oreodonts similar to an ancient curse that has been unleashed upon a person?
Oh, oh, yeah. Um, So for those of you who have, stayed pure and chaste and untouched, Oreodonts are the group of animals that I've worked on the most. They are a group of artiodactyls, which is animals that have hooves but have an even number of toes, which sounds like the stupidest distinction, but it is evolutionarily very important. And they look like pigs and they're probably related to camels and they do all sorts of weird stuff. And they're very cool and they're very common. Like they are everywhere in North America, which unfortunately has led to them being described as different species anytime someone finds one that has a slightly different nose that's uh, or had an injury. There's quite a few species that have been diagnosed as different species because they had bone infections that looked kind of weird.
Ah,
So, taxonomically, Oriodonts are an absolute nightmare. And they're just, yeah, it does feel like a curse because they're so cool and you want to do cool stuff with them. But if you want to talk about them at all, you have to decide what to call them, which with Oriodonts turns out to be a way more complicated task than most people are prepared to do, which is a real bummer.
so how has that further down the line
Hmm.
impacted your, I don't know, career and the kind of things you've chosen to pursue? Like, have you learned anything from the Oreodonts about yourself, I guess?
Mm. I have learned that I have this kind of knee-jerk reaction sometimes where a lot of the science that I do or want to do is to fix things. Is I see someone else either doing it incorrectly or I see something that has just been like it has been done poorly and I want to redo it the correct way. And I think that that has sometimes been good because if you're irritated, that can give you a certain degree of motivation. It is not something that has carried me through conclusions. So one of the things that I am going to try and deal with this year is that I have a bunch of Oriodont papers that are like 3/4 of the way written, but I started them because I was really irritated at somebody. And that irritation does not carry me all the way through a super long project. And I have struggled with some of these papers to find appropriate motivation to continue. Especially, I have one project that has we submitted it and we just got the stupidest reviews, like just like instructions that would take us 20 years to complete that the editor was like, that'll take you 10 minutes because they don't know anything about Oriodonts. So we submitted it to another journal and we got a different set of extremely stupid instructions. And it's been demoralizing to the extent where I have not finished that paper
Right.
because I don't have the irritation anymore to carry me through. I just have exhaustion that deals with
Right.
it. So I think the big lesson for me from Oriodonts is that I think I have to kind of really take my initial interest and kind of really carefully consider it because if it's just irritation based, that might be fine for a project that's going to take like 2 pages. But a project that's going to take like 2 years isn't going to be sustainable on irritation alone. I have to find something that's interesting and engaging about that
Right.
project and people to work with me because if I don't have co-authors, I'm not going to do it.
Nope.
I
No, no,
need
no.
outside motivation for sure.
Other people
Um,
to enforce
yeah.
upon you the fact that it needs to get done.
Yeah, exactly. And there is also a certain level of irritation where it's just like there's one paleontologist that I just have been irritated with for 5 years, and I just can't get up the energy anymore to deal with them. So, uh, yeah, I've got to find a different motivation to finish some of those
That,
papers.
done with it. We've kind of alluded a bit to how academia can be a slog, both as a student
Hmm.
as well as a professional.
Hmm.
How have you managed to maintain sanity?
How do you manage to, especially with academia where it's prolonged agony, right? Like academia, the recommended path is you work yourself to the bone and you don't just do it for 2 months, you do it
Right,
for 20 years. And then the payoff is that you're broken at the end of it and you don't have to do it anymore. Like
right.
yeah, it's garbage advice. Is that kind of what you're getting at with this question?
So what I was more curious about in working through the being a student in these
Hmm.
academic settings and being a professional, has there been anywhere that you've been able to find joy in these spaces as opposed to just kind of the stereotype of it's just burns people out, which it absolutely does, but I think
Yeah.
people, including yourself and I'm kind of
Hmm.
academic adjacent at least, you have to be able to at least find something that is keeping you engaged. Otherwise, we would just
Yeah.
leave outright.
I mean, I think, and I think this would be probably one of my pieces of advice to anybody, is leave. And you there's this big like I want to say misconception, but I think it's just a lie that academics tell one another and themselves, which is the idea that if you leave, you can never ever come back. And
Sure.
if you don't apply for 100 jobs, you're never going to get one. And if you don't write 20 papers, you're never going to get hired. And I think if that sounds daunting to you, which it should, uh, leave, because I left. I've left every career and then come back to something either the same or different. And every single time I've come back better for it. I am a better teacher now because I took a year off and worked as analyzing all of your creepy data and being real weird about it. I know more about students now. I know more data analysis techniques. I know more data visualization techniques. I know more about how administration works. Like, I think that if you are getting frustrated with something, really consider like the amount that it is actually worth to you. When I went back to applying for academic jobs, I decided that it was not worth it to me to apply for 100 jobs when I knew I wasn't gonna move to Alabama. Even if I got offered that job, I was not gonna take it. So
Right.
I applied to, I think my last round before I got hired for UA, I applied for 3 jobs. And I got interviewed for all of them because I only applied for them because I knew I was an incredibly good match and I absolutely would take the job if it was offered to me.
Right.
So I think a lot of the advice that you're given is it's kind of intended to be good. Like it's a good idea to publish papers, but if you publish bad papers, or what I've seen is if you publish papers in predatory journals because you
Sure.
don't know what a predatory journal is, maybe, um, people will find out, people will know, people will read your papers. And I would say quality quality work is always going to be better than quantity work, no matter what other people tell you. Quality work has been what has made me happy within my job. And then also remembering that I have a life outside of my job. Like when we moved back to Ellensburg to teach at Central for a year, um, I only decided to go because we found a piece of property where we could finally get miniature cows and sheep. Like, I refused to move back here if I could not have the thing that I have wanted since I graduated college, which was miniature cows. I've wanted miniature cows. I finally got my miniature cows. Did we have a house in that piece of property? No. Have we lived in a converted airplane hangar for 5 years? Yes. But I have a bunch of cows and sheep outside. And even when they're jerks, that is worth it. Like, I go out every lunch break and I in the spring I bottle feed baby lambs. In the summer I pull burrs out of their wool and pet them. And yeah, it makes it way better than just feeling like you have to dedicate 12 hours to doing something that is quantity. You got
Right.
to do quality would be, and figuring out what is quality for you is important too. It was more important to me to do things like publish a couple of papers that I was passionate about, publish, and then go and apply for big grants and do science writing, like science communication writing. That was more important to me than writing a whole bunch of papers that I didn't really want to write and that I didn't think were really useful. Like, one of the other pieces of advice is divvy up papers. Like, if you've got like 2 kind of topics, split them up, and then you have 2 separate papers. Yeah, but then you have 2 separate papers that are virtually the same topic that would be a much better product if they were in a single paper. So I don't do that anymore. If it makes sense to have it as one and it's going to fit the page length requirements of journals,
Right.
then it's one because that's a better quality product. And I think that quality genuinely is underrated sometimes in academic circles. But having been on many hiring committees, it's not actually that underrated. Like, when you're looking at products, we do read your stuff. It's better to have quality than quantity.
So much of that academic culture, though, really
Mhm.
revolves around this spoken, sometimes unspoken expectation that you're going to be doing, or at least you're going to be putting on airs that you're doing 60 hours a week.
Mhm.
Um, Whether or not you're actually doing 60 hours of work a week is perhaps
Yeah.
another conversation. Um, but given that that's at least for the foreseeable future kind of the culture, how would you recommend students and early career folks find their own tiny cows in life?
I would say that if you have to engage with that culture, I distinctly remember Edward telling me, uh, my advisor did not mandate that we were working 60 hours a week. But he had been in a culture in his graduate program where he said that the way he got around that is he would, do his work. And then instead of sending it in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd send it in at, he'd schedule it to send in at 1 in the morning so that his insane boss would think that he was working longer than he was. And I think that if you're in a subordinate position where you don't get to change the culture, um, doing stupid stuff like that, where you are being kind of sneaky about it and pretending to work more than you actually are, is a good strategy because, there's lots and lots of studies that say you work more efficiently and get more work done if you're working, 32 hours a week than if you work 40. And if you work 50 or 60, like the products, they don't scale. You
Right.
don't get that much more stuff done. You spend a lot of time rereading things and misunderstanding things and screwing things up. And I think the faster that you can learn what your limit is, the faster you will be able to actually produce stuff quickly. Because I think it's better to concentrate your efforts on something where you're actually going to get stuff done than slamming your head up against a wall. That said, there is an important transition that has to happen, which is when you get out of that environment where you were the subordinate and now you are in charge of setting things, you have to model better behavior. We have to move away from this dumb 60-hour-a-week thing. So, like, I have very firm guidelines about when I will respond to emails and when I will schedule meetings. And like, I stick to those because it's so easy for people to be like, oh, but can't you meet at 7 in the morning or can't you meet at 10 in the morning on a Sunday? And I have found that anytime I say no to those, all of a sudden those expectations slide and they can actually meet on a Monday at a regular time.
Right.
Um, there's there's no, especially in paleontology, these things have been dead for millions of years. Take your time. Like, they're not gonna go anywhere.
Right.
So I think modeling good behavior afterwards is really important too. And I try to make sure I do that, both because it's important so that other people don't feel that pressure. And also, it's still important for me. It's important for me to still maintain 40 or less hours of work a week because, yeah, there are going to be years where you can't do that. If you're a first year teacher, I'm so sorry. I've been there teaching brand new classes for the first time. It's tiring for us
Yeah.
all, but just be aware that no student is ever going to be upset if you call in sick for a day.
True enough.
Yeah, yeah.
So the question I think that um, everyone's been waiting for from you
Hmm.
specifically to get an
Oh,
answer
yeah.
from you specifically, which of the following dinosaurs is the best?
Okay. I mean, gosh darn it.
We'll find a fun sound effect to put in over that. Don't
Yeah,
you
yeah.
worry.
Oh, I
Um,
have one. I've got some Saiga sounds. They sound like little trumpets.
that'll be perfect. Yeah, you can just send me that
Yeah.
audio file. We'll curse as much as you want, and we'll just put
Yeah.
Saiga sounds over it. Um, so which of the following dinosaurs is the best?
Okay.
Not your favorite necessarily, but is the best.
Okay.
T-Rex,
Yeah.
Spinosaurus,
Ugh.
or Velociraptor.
Um, Velociraptor. And let me explain why. First off, Spinosaurus is the worst dinosaur, hands down, of all dinosaurs of all time. I once spent an entire day learning how to code a Twitter bot specifically to respond to people who were talking about Spinosaurus to tell them how many other cool, definitely aquatic creatures there were that had more than one body, for example. Second off, T-Rex is fine, but T-Rex is just overdone. Velociraptor also overdone, except that Velociraptor, of course, everybody thinks of the big thing, which is actually Deinonychus or Utah raptor, and Velociraptor was the size of a turkey. And I think that kind of like getting blown up beyond what your actual physical limitations are and like getting a reputation for being something you're totally not, That's way cooler than any of the others. So I'm going to go with Velociraptor.
Velociraptor is the best dinosaur. You heard it here first.
Nope, nope. It's the best of those three. Of the extremely limited options I was given, it is the best of those three.
I know
Don't you
you.
dare cut this on social media.
I'll start with you saying, "Don't you dare cut this," and then I'll bring in the cut part.
Uh-huh.
So I know you did an episode on fleshy bits on Weird and Dead
Mhm.
recently. Give us a summary of trunks on sauropods. I think that's something that deserves more attention more widely.
Yeah. Okay. So trunks, very common in mammals. They evolve a whole awful lot. Trunk, of course, is the big fleshy thing that an elephant has or a tapir has. They do more than what you see with an elephant. Elephants can pick things up. They can blow air really precisely. They can drink water. They can make weird sounds. But that's a muscular trunk. Trunks can do lots of other things. And so there's a very common bone thing that you see in the skull that tells us something had a trunk, and it's where your nose bones go goodbye. And of course, they get out of the way so that you can put a big fleshy nubbin in front of your eyeballs and still be able to see. You don't want to put the flesh on top of the nose. You want the nose bones to be gone. So anytime you see, uh-oh, no more nose bones, that either is something that's aquatic like a whale, or it's something that has a trunk. Or it's a dinosaur, and of course it didn't have a trunk because that would look too stupid, which has been basically the argument for sauropod dinosaurs. Sauropod dinosaurs, a lot of them, Diplodocus in particular is a good example. They have no nose bones. Their nose moves back here. It's they look like they should have a trunk, even though they've already done things like elongate their neck, elongate their tail, make their body really big. But they could have a trunk for making sound. They could have a trunk for sniffing things. They could have trunks for lots and lots of different purposes. And the only real paper that has been out there that has said no, sauropods don't have a trunk only looked at muscular trunks. And I agree, sauropods probably did not have an elephant trunk. But you can't tell me that they didn't have a weird filtration system trunk like Saiga do,
Right.
where maybe they're trying to not sneeze out dust. And of course, my own personal theory now that I'm going to be presenting to everybody, which is I think that Diplodocus had a weird little trunk so that it didn't sneeze out fern spores, so that it didn't inhale fern all the time. That's what I think it was for, was for
A
allergy
big,
prevention.
like a
Mhm.
kind of floppy Saiga
Yeah, just a
face
big,
lump.
weird, floppy face lump that prevents it from going all the way in. That's what I think they had it for.
I think I'd seen some, I don't know, hypothesizing about a muscular trunk
Hmm.
um in other sources before, and I think the air filtration makes it. It's like if your neck's already that long, what's the use of having like an extra 6-inch little
Yeah,
grabby thing on the front of your face?
and they have clipping teeth.
Yeah,
Um, so like they've still got the ability to clip leaves and stuff. So I don't think that they necessarily needed a trunk for like super specialized stuff. I do think that they still had a trunk. They still have the bony features of having a trunk, and maybe it was just one of those weird like big old kind of sound inflating things like elephant seals have,
sure.
just really sexy, big fleshy lump on top of their faces for other dinosaurs to admire. Um, there's lots of potentials. There's lots of
Yeah,
dumb ways to draw sauropod dinosaurs that are really underexplored, I think.
maybe they blew it up like a big balloon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big red balloon on their face.
Yeah. Big red bird balloon on their face. Yeah.
Earlier you talked a bit about writing for PBS
Yeah.
eons. How did you come to get kind of plugged into that?
So during graduate school, my friend Amy Atwater and I started writing a blog, and we were writing about a lot of things, mostly about misogyny and racism and paleontology, but like a lot of like this animal was really cool. Look at this weird fossil animal. To like inject a positive nature into what we were talking about. And the editor at the time for Eons came across our blog and reached out to both of us. And Amy was too busy at the time, but I wasn't. So I agreed to write a script, and then I found out that I was actually going to get paid for it. So then I agreed to write a bunch of scripts. And the rest is history. So having a public portfolio, if you want to get tapped as a writer, even if you are the one reaching out to people to write for them, having something visible that they can see where you've written
Right.
for either yourself or someone else is important.
It sounds like that was a bit happenstance, so like it wasn't something you were out kind of looking for.
No, it definitely wasn't. I had considered doing things like writing for science magazines. I didn't know that shows like SciShow and Eons were scripted because they kind of hide that information. I don't think it's on purpose, but they put that information at the very end. So most people think that the hosts are the ones writing those scripts, and they're not. They're hiring freelance writers for it. Yeah, so I just didn't really realize that that was a thing that I could do. And I was in graduate school. So until somebody approached me, I was too busy to really look into it too much. I would also say that even though like I've done a lot of writing, I took a lot of creative writing classes in college. That's always been kind of a career that was discouraged for me and for most people. People will tell you that like arts and humanities aren't going to get you paid, and like writing isn't going to get you paid. And it's what got me my academic job that everyone thought writing 1,000 papers was going to get me. So, if you're really interested in something, there are careers that you can pursue in it. And it's never bad to have another skill, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point as far as there's a lot of survivorship bias that happens in academia
Mhm.
and in advising where people may be acting with as much kindness and good
Oh
intentions
yeah,
as
they're
they
not.
can, but
Yeah.
they if they went straight from high school to postdoc to being a professor,
Mhm.
their awareness of success strategies is going to potentially be quite narrow. And
Yeah.
the advice that they're going to give is, unless they've gone out of their way to get other perspectives, is probably going to reflect that.
Yeah.
It's probably a good thing for both people in an advising capacity as well as students who are being advised to keep in
Yeah.
mind. What would be your top three, top five, whichever one you prefer?
Mhm.
What would be your top five tips for somebody who is in graduate school that they've been
Okay.
accepted for surviving that experience successfully?
Okay. Number one is if you are going to get a graduate degree in geology or biology, which is usually where paleontology hides out, you should be getting paid. And if you are not getting paid, you shouldn't go there. Uh, Paleontology is not a degree that by itself gets you a huge paycheck. So going into debt to get the prerequisites, especially at a graduate level, is not a good idea. And at a graduate level, especially with geology, if a geology department cannot afford to pay for you and your tuition, they're probably not a great department. Like it's super, super common for geology departments to have money to pay for their students. And if they're taking in ones that they can't afford, that means that they look at you as if you are a paycheck for them as opposed to a researcher. So I would be very careful about going to one of those schools. And honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. If you don't have funding,
Right.
I don't think it's worth it. I think it's better to take a year off and get more experience and then apply to somewhere else. Because yeah, so get paid. That would be number one. Find some form of exercise that you enjoy that you can do while you're in school. You have to avoid going insane. Find a group of people who are not in graduate school. I wasn't very good at this one, but it's really, really important to have people who are outside of academia to give a little bit of perspective on when things are insane. Four, I would say, I want to say, figure out who HR is so you can complain, but be aware that depending on what you're complaining about, HR might not be helpful. So make sure that you establish who it is that you go to as an authority figure if something goes wrong, especially if something goes wrong with your advisor.
Right.
And that's probably not going to be the department head because the department head works with your advisor and it's going to be way harder for them to separate that. So if you are having a big problem with your advisor, maybe if you are a graduate student in a union, knowing who your union representatives are,
Sure.
knowing other graduate students who have kind of ties to those sorts of things, knowing your escape route is important.
Right.
Fifth, you can transfer. I did that a bunch in undergraduate. I didn't end up doing it in graduate school because I liked my program, but just be aware, you don't have to stay there. Lots of graduate students transfer. It's not something that is an option that people talk about, but if you don't like your program or you're not getting paid enough, you can look into other places and you're more likely to get a position if you're transferring than if you are enrolling for the first time. So yeah, that's a lot about escaping.
Yeah, but I
I did
think
like graduate school. My graduate advisor was great, but I did have some bad experiences and I've heard of way worse. So, it's important to identify potential exits, even if you love what you're doing.
but I think there's also a lot of good wisdom there about stabilizing because graduate
Mm-hmm.
school is inherently very difficult. And if you're having excessive financial stress
Yeah.
or other things that are like your physical health, mental health, um, that are starting to crack a
Mm-hmm.
bit along the way, the strain that comes from just completing a graduate degree, be it a master's, PhD, or whatever, is going to impact you a lot more, especially over a 2 to 5 year period, depending on the length of your
Yeah.
program. And
Yeah.
so I think that some of that, not necessarily those activities or those considerations just for the sake of themselves, but considering this as a both the grad school as well as the career that comes after is a long game. And if you're lighting yourself on fire in order
Mm-hmm.
to light up a room, um, that's not a good sustainable strategy.
You'll burn out. Yeah. Pace yourself. I think my advisor described it as a marathon, not a sprint. I would describe it as like you're hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. You don't have to run. You just have to make steady, slow progress.
Right. You mentioned HR a bit there.
Hmm.
And I know that you've done DEI work, especially
Hmm.
with gender equity in sciences.
Hmm.
What advice would you have for, especially somebody that is in a graduate program, they're a graduate student at that school, or they're somebody early career, say that they are
Yeah.
pre-tenure or whatever that entails for them. Strategies for getting bad behavior dealt with while minimizing, not eliminating, but minimizing the harm that they could be doing themselves.
Yeah. Um, I think so. Having been sexually harassed and assaulted at several positions in my career, and also having gotten multiple people fired, I would say I'm in a pretty good position to tell you what works. Um, and I think the biggest piece of advice that I have is stop it the very first time. Um, I don't mean go to HR, but like if someone says something that makes you a little uncomfortable, assume it's going to get worse because in my experience, it always does. It always gets worse. And if you put your foot down, that doesn't mean it's not going to get worse, but it does mean that at least you have a record of you saying something to that person. And then you don't have to live in the ambiguity of, well, maybe if I just clarified that that made me uncomfortable, just clarify that it makes you uncomfortable as soon as you can. You can just make a little like, oh, I don't, that made me a little uncomfortable. Let's not talk about that. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Um, Write everything down and tell another person about it. That doesn't have to be your boss or HR, but telling a witness has made big differences in my life and big differences in the lives of my friends. And I will also say that if you are repeatedly traumatized, it can be hard to remember details. So making sure that you write things down can give you a resource for if you do decide to complain later on. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes you're not going to be around that person enough to make it worth the emotional turmoil of actually going and dealing with it. Uh, you are almost never alone. Actually, never. You are never the only person they're doing this to. Um, everybody seems to think that like if you complain, it just makes you look bad. You're the only person. I have never seen a case where there was just one person getting that. There's always a history. There's always someone else that's been getting a similar treatment, and they might decide to complain too if you decide to complain. Um, and as far as who to complain to, it depends. If you trust your department chair and you know that they don't like that person, you should talk to them. Um, if you don't, you can talk to HR, but be aware HR is there to protect the company, but they do have to make a record of it. And finally, if nothing else works, keep moving up the chain. I've gotten people fired in the past because then I emailed their boss, that didn't do anything. I emailed that boss's boss, that didn't do anything. I emailed HR, that didn't quite do anything. So I emailed the president of the company. And if they hadn't done anything, I would have gone public. And that
Right.
right there is the big threat. If you have receipts that you have written down, people you have talked to, witnesses, if you can find anybody else who's experienced any of the same stuff, all of that, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's racial discrimination, whether it's disability discrimination, all of that can be really helpful. And you just kind of, if you have the energy for it and it's important enough for you, don't be afraid to escalate, because there's going to be a level where people are going to get in trouble.
Right.
And it doesn't usually take going public, but it sometimes does take the threat of going public. There's also lots of resources outside of universities. So if you are experiencing discrimination, there are lawyers that will at least talk to you for free and kind of consider whether your case is worth taking. There are other people that will pay for your lawyers on occasion. And there are lawyers who will work basically with just the assurance that if they win, they get money after they win. So yeah, there are options. You are never actually alone, even if it feels like it. And it always is as big of a deal as you think it is, because it is going to get worse, which is really frustrating, but
And
it is.
sometimes those folks that are doing these things basically survive on the inaction of other people for decades in
Yeah.
some cases because
Which
of
doesn't
their
mean you have
position
to
of
martyr
power.
yourself,
Right.
right? Like
Yeah.
you don't have to be the person who calls. If it's easier for you and it's going to be better for your life to just ignore it and move on, especially if you're right at the end, okay, that's fine. You can also come back 5 years later. I've done that. I've gone back several years later and gotten someone fired for their behavior while I was there when I was in a more secure position.
Right.
So, yeah, but yeah, they are usually using their position of power. They are not just doing it to you, they're doing it to anybody that they can. Um, and yeah, uh, it's worth it to complain if you can, but you don't have to. You are not the martyr that has to fall on the sword to protect other women or other people of color or whatever the form of discrimination is. And it's usually more than one, honestly. It's very rarely one. Um, yeah, but there are pathways to success. Those are usually the ones that don't show up in the paper, by the way. Usually that professor just kind of disappears.
Right.
Nobody really
Oof.
says anything about why they're banned from campus.
A completely a bit of a different topic,
Yeah,
but
more positive, I'm sure.
hopefully a bit more uplifting. Although I think that information is still very valuable. Hopefully not needed, and hopefully will be less
Yeah.
needed going in the future.
Hmm.
But it's not something that we typically get training on how to go about
Yeah.
handling those kinds of problems. It's more just like it, in my experience, it's been more of just like we just whisper about it, but we don't necessarily like directly
Yeah.
deal with it
Yeah.
for a number of reasons. Um, what's something I think this is something else that folks may find some value in, just because I don't know, pursuing some of these professional careers can be quite intimidating. You're kind of
Hmm.
feeling around in the dark and stumbling along the way a bit in some form or another. What are some what is a situation or situations where you found very difficult or something that you failed at that turned out to be really valuable despite that failure in the future?
Um, Quitting jobs. There's like a just be aware, you don't have to put every job on your resume, especially if you were, say, only there for a month because you hated it. There's a lot of weird little also side quests that I took that did not work out and I quit immediately. Um, and I think that, yeah, don't be afraid to move. Don't be afraid to change, and don't be afraid to just not mention things on your resume if you think that that is a bad thing. Um, every time that I've quit a job, uh, it has made me kind of realize a little bit like the behavior at the next job. Like I have found that like as I've kind of gone on in my career, like I usually people quit because of the same reason, which is their supervisor sucks. Like that's almost always what it is. And you kind of get this like each time you go to a new job, I feel like it's like a different type of bad that you'll put up with, but it makes you really good at identifying the bad that led to the the worst behavior that caused you to leave before. So it makes you a lot more cognizant of good versus bad leadership. I think it also makes you a lot more cognizant of your own behavior if you are going to be in a leadership position. I think that
Mhm.
having bad bosses is incredibly good training for things to avoid. Um, so yeah, I think that the things that I've failed at have been jobs where I couldn't hack it, or I hated it so much, which is usually the same thing, that I left. And I
Mhm.
have not ever regretted leaving those positions. Even when leaving those positions has done things like put me on food stamps,
Sure.
it was still absolutely worth it.
So in the same vein, are there any instances where you found either short or long-term success in a place where you weren't really expecting to find it?
I think eons, honestly. I didn't really expect that to go anywhere. Um, I did end up trying to, actually, this is another thing I failed at, is after writing for them as a scriptwriter for a year, the editor invited me to be a junior editor. And so I did that for a couple of months, but it was while I was on a big road trip. And it was really hard to keep up with. And it was not financially worth it in the same way that script writing was because I was a faster script writer than I was editor. Um, and I was butting heads a lot with the senior editor where I would edit a script and think it was fine and he would think it was really bad still and get really upset with me. I eventually realized that it was not worth kind of risking my professional relationship with Eons and with that editor to
Right.
keep trying to be a junior editor and that it was better to kind of back off. Um, so I would say that that editor position was pretty short term, but it definitely, I think it still helped me a lot with recognizing like some of my own weaknesses in recognizing flaws. I've always thought that like I'm very flawed at recognizing flaws in my own work. It's very hard to see problems when you've been spending 20 hours writing something. But it turns out that that is a pattern that kind of sometimes extends to other people's work as well. There are things that I don't see. I see other things very well. But it I turn out to be a little bit more short-sighted than I actually thought that I was. Um, and it helped me kind of understand the writing process from other people's perspective as well. And of course, working for eons, even part-time, even as a freelance scriptwriter, even as an editor for like 2 months, all of
Hmm.
that has been helpful on my resume as well as um, skill-wise. So
But I think that there's some really good points there as far as one, being able to have I don't know, the self-awareness to know something isn't going well and that you can take action in order to reduce damage that might
yeah,
do in something that you're otherwise enjoying, like the script writing as you've
yeah,
described it. I think also in these spaces sometimes, especially again, we talk a lot about like students and folks who are early career, or kind of aspiring to get into these kind of science career spaces like you and
mhm,
I are in. Um, that the people component
yeah,
gets lost because there's this really strong passion for the science, whatever it may be. But at a certain point, and often sooner than I think people expect,
Oh yeah.
people skills become as necessary as science skills. And I was
Yes.
wondering if you could give any advice for getting out in front of that for
Therapy.
therapy. There you go.
You know, most of us are not well conditioned to have very polite conversations about our boundaries. Like, and therapy can be very helpful for a lot of reasons, but it can also be very helpful in giving you the vocabulary and giving you a space to practice what you're going to say before you say it to someone. So yeah, I think when I was younger, my response to things going bad with other people was, if I ignore it for long enough, it will go away. It doesn't. It doesn't matter what type of problem it is. It's not like it just disappears unless they quit, and then it does disappear. But yeah, I think learning how to tell another person very politely how their behavior affects you, and like in a way that is as inoffensive as it possibly can be, is really important and really hard. I think it's even harder in jobs like paleontology and in summer camps, even where you are often in the field with someone. You might live with someone for weeks at a time. You
Right.
are in each other's back pockets. It can be really daunting to tell that person who is your boss and also your roommate to a certain extent, that they need to stop doing something because it's making you really unhappy. So yeah, it's a hard skill to learn, but it is definitely worth learning and practicing. Don't be afraid to apologize for things that are absolutely not your fault, as long as you think that it's going to actually make them apologize for something that is their fault. Compromising is good.
Tactful manipulation for
Yeah,
the greater
it's true. It
good.
is it is tactful manipulation to be like, I'm so sorry that I did that. I didn't do that. That was you. Um, but I would appreciate it if
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Gaslighting for the greater good.
What is it? Girl boss, gatekeep, gaslight,
Yeah.
socially manipulate. It's not quite as resonant in there, but
Yeah, but for the purpose of improving a situation as opposed to just creating drama or
mhm.
harming someone.
Especially if you think that it's going to make you explode. Like if it's something that is going to make you so mad that you're going to scream at some point, that's not nearly as professional of a look as it is to sit down and awkwardly stumble through what is making you so upset.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Megan, this has been fantastic and I think really valuable for folks who are going to see it. Do you have any last bits of wisdom or recommendations for students and kind of early career folks who are in like earth life sciences, or maybe they're in something else and looking to kind of move into these spaces from some other academic discipline?
Statistics will get you really far in a lot of smaller positions, but communication skills will get you further in a position that requires a lot of statistics. Which is like the great irony of the world, right? Like if you're applying for a position where doing statistics is like 10% of your job, having any form of statistics is going to give you a leg up because everybody else is going to have the other 90%. But they might not have that 10%. But if you are applying for like an upper level position where statistics is 90% of your job, they want someone who can talk to other people. And I think that that's going to be, it's the same for a lot of different skills. Um, if you're gonna get miniature cows, I would say uh, make sure that you check their feet first, because it turns out those are genetic and they're a real pain in the butt to deal with. So that's my career advice for you: is check your mini cow's foot before you purchase it.
I think that's, I mean, we can take that as a metaphor.
Sure,
Um,
it's not a metaphor. It's like a very specific targeted piece of advice. But
if there's something you really care about and you want it to go well, make sure you're doing your due diligence.
check its feet. Yeah.
Check its feet. That can
Oh,
be a
see how many
bumper
people have
sticker.
left that position. If you're applying for academic positions, especially lectureships, uh, take a look at how many people have held that position in the last 10 years, and that'll give you a good idea of whether you should apply or not.
If they have a high turnover rate, that may mean something about the culture or other factors at that institution.
Mm-hmm. Especially if they go on to like be anything that is not academic afterwards. If they are leaving a lectureship to go teach high school, um, think twice about applying, I'd say.
Right. They're just bailing on academia
Yeah.
altogether. Maybe a
Yeah.
bit of a
LinkedIn
warning
LinkedIn
sign.
is the hooves of an academic job.
There we go. Check the hooves.
Yes, yes.
Well, Meaghan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank
And
you for
if
having me.
folks want to check out other stuff that you're working on, Weird and Dead, podcast with Amy
Mhm.
Atwater, and you're
Steel
pretty
pedal
active
fabric.
on, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
the
Got
store I
that.
keep forgetting to promote.
Let's
Oh
see.
yeah. Ah.
And then you're pretty active on TikTok where people can go to see
Mhm.
you prepping fossils and meet your goats and tiny cows and
Yeah.
your two dogs and all kinds of other good stuff.
Yes, my menagerie of hoarded animals. Yeah.
Your emotional support creatures that you
Yeah.
keep on
Yeah.
site.
We have 17 sheep right now. It's way too many. They all had twins or triplets. It's exhausting. Very cute though.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, Meaghan, and we'll see you guys next time.